welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow, India's only daily television platform for small businesses. As the coronavirus outbreak continues to intensify, global startup ecosystems are among the hardest hit, which raises the question, what sort of startups are best equipped to weather the storm? Well, to take the topic head on, we're joined by a very special guest on the show tonight, the co-founder and chief operating officer of Oddup, Jackie Lam. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Pooja. Lovely to meet you, and thank you for having me there.
Now, Jackie, I think I'm stating the obvious in saying that the coronavirus pandemic has made for an especially challenging time for startups. But what's perhaps not so obvious is how startups can and should reorient themselves in the wake of drying up demand. Your thoughts?
I think the pandemic has hit every startup globally in such a sudden manner. We at Oddup, we've also suddenly been having to rethink of our business model and how we work. You can see I'm also working from home in the San Francisco office. My co-founders in Hong Kong and the rest of the team are also in their work from home state. So this particularly has been something that we've had to think about. I'm sure other startups have also had to relook at how they do their working from home or remote working arrangements. We've had to look at our technology, is it sustainable? And we've also had to look at reducing expenses. So a lot of the time as startups build, they add on different expenses. So we've had to look at culling maybe the nice to haves and look at creating what we call a minimum viable organization. And I'm sure many other startups out there are looking at doing the same as well.
Now, startup markets worldwide have been described as highly fragmented. And seeking out any sort of credible and clear information across sectors has proven to be a challenge for entrepreneurs and for investors alike. How is Oddup, as a startup rating platform, attempting to bridge that gap?
Startups have always been in a fragmented space purely because, number one, startups are so early stage. And they're at the early stage, there's very little information out there about them. So this is a very issue that me and my co-founder had, and we created Oddup to try and bridge this gap and try to reduce the fragmentation and also the lack of transparency in startups. So what we do is we are a research provider and also a data provider, and we give startups a score on Oddup, giving them from 0 to 100, and really the score is an indicator of health. If you're an investor, you could look at the score as also the risk tolerance.
What's also so incredibly interesting to me about the Oddup score is that it essentially rates startups with an analyst view, a very tangible buy, hold, or sell rating, which is somewhat similar to what you might expect in a sell-side equity research model. So that said, I'm curious to understand what luck have Oddup buy-rated startups had with respect to securing funding from investors in the market?
I'd say at any one time around 20% of the startups on Oddup have a buy rating. And out of these 20%, maybe about 3/4 of them do go ahead to get additional funding. For instance, say that they are in their Series A. If they've got a buy rating, then typically they've gone on to be able to raise significant funding, Series B in this case, over the next 18 months or so. So for us, and certainly for the startups and investors looking at those startups to do any follow-up round, the buy rating is absolutely essential. It's not only based on analyst reviews, it's then also based on the data as well. So I mentioned data is a huge integral part of Oddup, and we look at really ensuring that the data is accurate.
Now, between these Oddup scores that come with a buy, hold, or sell rating, to what extent do you believe these ratings instill investor confidence? Do you believe that Oddup is essentially empowering speculators on the sidelines to participate in the startup investment activity and larger market?
Pooja, I think one of the key things in investing in startups is to have as much information as possible. So if you're an investor particularly interested in early stage startups, really equip yourself with as much information. And this is what we're doing in Oddup, and we have been doing for the past five and a half years now. So the buy rating is only one of the many different data aspects. We also have the Oddup score, which you mentioned, the 0 to 100. And we also have scores such as the social traction scores, web presence, and so forth. So really feeding the investor as much information and knowledge as possible is what we're trying to do.
And in the wake of this global health crisis, have you seen the Oddup score experience dramatic volatility, unpredictability? And if so, how do you sort of stand behind its credibility given the circumstances?
Yeah, great question for this current time. I think with what's happened with many startups really suddenly having to put a brake on their business or even hibernate for a while, we have seen some significant drops in some of our startups, particularly those that are not your traditional tech startups or the e-commerce delivery startups, right? Those have spiked and have increased and increased in the Oddup score, but those that are probably more manufacturing based, for instance, healthcare, those have not done as well in the past 2-3 months. And there is quite significant volatility in the scores.
So in the current climate, who do you think this platform is most geared towards? Is it the entrepreneurs themselves as they monitor sector-wide activity and keep an eye on their competition? Is it for investors, everyone ranging from angel investors to incubators to perhaps venture capitalists? Or is the platform more specifically oriented towards investment banks and private equity firms that are, of course, spearheading all of the IPO and merger and acquisition activity in the startup space?
So I think now in this current climate, the platform is still catering to the large data houses who we have partners with. Predominantly the premier data houses such as Bloomberg, Reuters, and Dow Jones are still after this data. When we look at the angel investors and more of the individual retail investors, it's just not a good time to invest. Startups are struggling. They're looking at surviving rather than growth. So it's not a good time for investors to be investing. So all this data then helps us form a wider picture to be what we see is going to happen in the next quarter or so as we start the road to recovery, as countries start to open up. I think data still is important. The nice to have type data probably will suffer a bit, but the must have data will continue to be needed.
Well, walk us through the underlying technology here that's essentially powering the Oddup platform such that it's able to track worldwide startup developments real time.
So Oddup has a number of elements, and data analytics and software is one of them. Research analysts, physical research analysts is another one of them. We started out purely with about an 80-20% split, with research analysts doing a lot of the groundwork, going out to visit startup founders, going to meetups, listening to what's happening in each of the startup ecosystems. As we grew, this model for us didn't work as well as the technology and the data model. So we put technology around a lot of the research, and now our tech and data teams are our larger teams. And they have then integrated a lot of AI into the data models and the analytics models. So every day what you see is a very, very, I guess, a volatile data set where if one particular startup has suddenly been acquired, then that kind of information is extracted from the web. And then all this then turns into, number one, the score, the Oddup score, and then the buy, hold, sell views.
Now, the long-standing perception in the market has been that acquiring detailed startup data is time-consuming, it's expensive, and ultimately it may not necessarily translate into success. Do you believe that these perceptions are now beginning to shift?
I think acquiring startup data is still extremely difficult by pure virtue of the number of startups that start up every year. It has been very difficult to identify the number of startups that are going to succeed as well. So in Oddup, we rely a lot on the startup co-founders themselves to give us information. Now, not everyone is at the stage to be able to deliver that kind of information. So a lot of our information then is calculated and data is extracted. A lot of the models we used are forecasts as well. And we rely very much so on social media, any kind of news that the startup has published or announced. Any kind of funding rounds, particularly, we're very interested in, because that gives us the ability to then project what kind of funding round they may be going on to or what kind of valuation that they are at.
Sure.
It was our move to the US that introduced us to the India market of startups. And looking at data across all the various Indian startups also then helped build our depth and our startup universe.
Follow up on a point you just made, which is perhaps present scenario aside, a staggering number of startups are created year over year, right?
Yes.
And they are all competing in and for the same pool of Series A money. So that said, to what extent does the Oddup platform essentially empower investors to help comb through the clutter?
Yes, thousands of startups do get started every year, and every startup is looking for money. If there is a startup that says they're not fundraising, I would be surprised, because every startup can use with more funds. What happens with Oddup is, if you're a startup founder, you are immediately then exposed to thousands of investors using Oddup to look for startups that match their investment thesis or match their risk level. So Oddup is one of the platforms that you can use as a startup founder to really be seen by investors.
Well, walk us through how Oddup has grown over the years. Is this growth essentially largely organic, or would you describe it more as strategic?
Oddup started about five and a half years ago with James and myself, my co-founder, and we had a very small team, 2 to 4. We grew quickly, and we saw a need of needing startup data in Hong Kong. Hong Kong then grew into needing information in Singapore and Taiwan, Australia and China. So there was a lot of a need for data in the Asia and the Asia Pacific region. It was our move to the US that introduced us to the India market of startups. And looking at data across all the various Indian startups also then helped build our depth and our startup universe. So now we do have a significant universe of startups. I think, as we've grown, we've moved and we've morphed from a research company into a data and tech company. And it was when we changed into this data and tech company where we really could scale at a much broader level.
Well, what do you consider to be some of the most unique characteristics of the Indian startup landscape? And therefore, which sectors do you think hold the most promise?
Oh, that's a good question. I think India has such a significant amount of unique nuances, but despite these nuances, it's such a large nation with over 1.3 billion people. Even the smallest product or service can have quite an impactful and significant presence, right? Purely market potential and economics wise. I think with the Indian economy continuing to grow and with the masses being able to have a higher purchasing power, I think the middle and high income level subsector is increasing. Then their needs and their wants of sophisticated apps, products is growing. So I think there definitely is a niche there. To my knowledge of India, there is a huge diversity in culture, though. Culture, language, and so forth. So I think any startup who is able to bridge and create a startup or product that crosses the pan-India surface will succeed. I think, to my knowledge, those companies that also service countries outside of India succeed very well as well, because there's such a huge diaspora of Indians across the world.
Now, my understanding is that upwards of 50,000 unique visitors are leveraging the Oddup proprietary platform every day. What keeps them coming back in your view? What is the single leading factor?
Yes, you're right. About 50,000 users do go to Oddup each day, and the single factor would be the data. So the volatility of the data, whether it be the score or the social presence. The buy, hold, sell views do not actually change that much. So they only change if significant events happen in the marketplace. For instance, there was a funding event, or another person has joined the board of a startup, or a marketing manager has joined. So the buy, hold, sell views don't change, but it's actually the volatility of the score that changes significantly. And that's the insight that it gives investors a view of what's happening in the startup that they've invested in, or in the startup that they're wanting to invest in.
And what are Oddup's expansion plans going forward, not simply in India, but beyond?
The past 2-3 months also has been quite difficult for us. We have asked everyone to work from home, which now seemingly has worked very well. So for us, while expanding further definitely is on the horizon, it's not something we're thinking about in the immediate.
Perhaps not from the perspective of geography, but with respect to the product suite and the solution suite. What do you believe is the need of the hour? What do investors approach you with? What do startups approach you with in terms of their unmet queries?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I think from a startup founder perspective, they are very interested in visibility. So gaining that visibility to more and more investors is extremely useful to them, not only from a potential fundraising capacity, but you never know, as a startup founder, you may actually find an investor who would be really great as an advisor for your company. Or they may have a particular partnership which can help you grow even further. So from a startup perspective, we're still looking to help startups very much. From an investor perspective, companies such as Bloomberg and Dow Jones continue to use us. Now we're looking at other larger companies as well to use our data as well. So we're looking at expanding into more corporates.
Now the Oddup score, which serves as a health barometer of a startup, has begun to be considered as an industry benchmark. And Oddup is widely touted as the startup that rates startups. How do you respond to that brand image? What sort of emotions do you experience when you hear that?
Yes, the startup that rates startups is what we do. When we first started out, we had a tagline or a logo which said the startup rating system, and that's essentially what we did and we continue to do. And we take it very seriously because that is the data that is trusted not only by individual angel investors, but by our corporates. So that's what we do, and that's what we take very seriously. And we're proud to have the startup score, which is now seen as the industry benchmark.
Jackie, before we call it a wrap, any last parting words for our viewers who may be watching, and particularly our female entrepreneurs who will surely draw inspiration from your journey?
Yeah, look, I think, thank you very much, first of all, again, for having me. But my advice to other entrepreneurs, particularly female entrepreneurs, is, keep going at it. I've been working in the startup space for over 10 years now, and it's never been easy, but it's very rewarding.
All right. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Pooja. Appreciate it.